Late night bites with friends? Already hard to beat. That first too hot bite of fries you couldn't wait for, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Now that hits different. Suddenly, the energy kicks back in, the night goes longer, and the laughs don't stop. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
Did you know with the Sam's Club app, you're technically in the club no matter where you are? Like, this is a club. This is also a club. And this is a club. My bad. Come join us. Sam's Club.
Hi, Nat Doig here, and just a heads up that this episode does contain some discussion around suicide, but I do warn you before we get to that section. There's also descriptions of some horrible deaths in the Victorian times. Welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful, and a little off-kilter in the town of Biggleswade and its surrounding area. Whether you like your history with a pinch of the paranormal or your paranormal stories with historical context, this is the show for you. Whether it's the tale of haunted Houghton House or the Glen Miller mystery, or maybe Victorian murder mysteries are your thing, make yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax while I take you on a journey into the weird. It's late September 1988 and 12-year-old Sam is crouched in the long grass next to her cousin Jessie. It's 6:30 p.m. and the sunset is drawing near. The worry which has crawled up from Sam's stomach and is rattling around her chest finally blurts out of her mouth. "Jessie, the streetlights will be coming on soon. Shouldn't we be heading home?"
Shush. Mum won't be back until 8. She's on the late shift, and Steve doesn't care where I am as long as I'm not bothering him. You've got to be quiet and concentrate, or we won't hear it.
Sam fidgets, the grass tickling at her ankles. Jessie, in contrast, is perfectly still, poised. Sam doesn't know how she does it, to stay so still, so focused. The wind, which has been non-existent for most of the day, suddenly rattles through the grass and the nearby brambles. The ones they had argued about earlier. Other worries are cycling through Sam's mind. Getting home after dark. What if their bikes have been nicked? When were her parents going to collect her? Were they really going to have a divorce, like Jessie claimed? The sound is distant at first, but unmistakable. Hearing it shuts down all of Sam's rotating thoughts. Now she's gripped with a fear so overwhelming, she freezes. And it's as still as Jessie. Getting closer by the second is the noise of a steam train, an antique sound, relegated to school trips to heritage railways and old films. But there is no mistaking it. The rattling and huffing of an actual steam locomotive is building, getting closer. Sam can hear the power of the engine. This isn't like a recording from a film, except there is no railway line below them, no track for the train to be trundling along. What there is, though, below them, is an abandoned tunnel. Once upon a time, there had been working track here, leading into that tunnel, but only the dark and empty tunnel remains. The train's whistle, signalling its imminent descent into darkness, is the last straw for Sam. She squeals in fright when it sounds. The stillness of her fear erupts into uncontrollable trembling and shaking, and she puts her hands over her ears, not wanting to hear the impossible sound of the invisible train. Jessie sold the bike ride to Sam by telling her about the wonderful nature on the reserve. Jessie claimed she had volunteered there in the summer holidays, clearing away brambles and recording butterfly numbers with her best friend Kelly, whose dad helped look after the site.
The army were using the place for some kind of exercise last week. We were all warned not to go up there. that if we heard gunfire, not to worry. It was only blank rounds being fired. But I want to go and see what they left behind, Sam. There might be spent shell casings and who knows what else.
Are you sure the army have gone now? Sam asked, not wanting to get into trouble with anyone.
Yeah, they're long gone. There shouldn't be anyone up there this weekend.
Sam hadn't asked if they were allowed to be up there. She didn't want to know. Being out of the house meant that she didn't have to sit through yet another episode of The Young Ones, which Jessie watched over and over again on video, guffawing at all the jokes she'd heard at least 500 times already. It was a still afternoon. There'd been fog in the morning, and Sam guessed there might be mist or fog by nightfall again. There was an autumnal nip in the air, even though it wasn't windy. Sam was surprised by the rambling nature of the site. Lots of long grass and brambles full of blackberries. She reached out to grab one of the juicy-looking berries, but Jessie slapped her hand back before she could pick it.
You can't eat blackberries this late. The devil will have weed on them.
I don't believe in the devil, and nor do you.
I don't know. He might be real.
Jessie had looked about cautiously, as if the devil might be lurking behind one of the bushes or scrubby trees nearby.
There's things here on this site that can't be explained.
What do you mean?
Well, the tunnel. It's haunted.
Sam rolled her eyes. Having to stay with her cousins over the weekend at first seemed like a nice thing to do. She'd last seen Jessie 2 Christmases ago. Growing up until the age of 10, they'd both spent lots of time with each other. Then Jessie's mum had remarried, and not long after, the family had moved to Bedfordshire, miles away from where Sam lived. Now they were both 12, and Sam felt that Jessie seemed like a different person. Her eldest cousin, Steve, who was 17, well, he now seemed like an adult and a complete stranger to her. They'd left him at Sam's house fixing his car. Jessie's family was so different to her own. Jessie and Steve seemed to live separate lives from each other and from their mum and stepdad. Jessie was even allowed to come home to an empty house after school now, to just let herself in, make her own tea until her mum came back from her job in Bedford. Her stepdad, he was often away. Meanwhile, Sam felt stifled at home. Her parents were always around, always knew where she was, always knew where she was going to be. All this freedom at Jessie's felt intoxicating, both thrilling, but it also left Sam a little queasy. Why is there a tunnel here anyway? Sam asked. The nature reserve was surrounded by fields of sprouts. It seemed like a very peculiar place to have a tunnel.
There was an old railway line here. Steam trains, all that jazz. The tunnel was cut through the Greensand Ridge. That's what Kelly's dad says anyway. They've turned the tunnel into a bat haven. They all roost in there, upside down. Little blood-sucking vampire bats. Mwah!
Sam rolled her eyes again. We don't have vampire bats in the UK.
Well, there's not just bats in that tunnel. There's men screaming to be let out. That's because a load of navvies died down there in that tunnel when it was being built in Victorian times. The sand soil fell in on them, trapping them down there. If you're here at night, you can hear their screams. I've heard them. They're terrible.
It's probably foxes or owls or even the bats that you can hear, not men screaming from the past. That's just not possible.
Well, it's not just the ghost of the navvies who built the tunnel you can hear. There's a ghost train as well. You can hear it go through the tunnel. If you don't believe me, come with me. We'll hide out just above the tunnel entrance. You have to be still up there. You must concentrate like if you're doing a Ouija board or light as a feather, stiff as a board. If you're still and focused, then you might hear the ghost train. I've heard it tons of times. Tons of times. Most evenings you can hear it. We should try it now. It's almost time.
Sam felt her insides tighten. She twisted her hands around, tried to think of a reason to say no. She had plenty. They'd left their bikes at the edge of one of the fields of sprouts. And, well, what if they were stolen? But that wouldn't cut it with Jessie. She was already scrambling up the slope. All Sam could do was scramble after her. And that's how Sam found herself crouched down in the grass, listening to the sound of an impossible train approach and then pass beneath them into the tunnel. As she shakes, Sam falls back into a seated position. She takes her hands from her ears and hugs her knees to her chest. She begins to rock. What she is hearing is impossible. The rattling of the carriages now comes from underneath her. But where she would have expected the ground to shake, there is nothing. Not even a blade of grass trembles. Sam glances over to Jessie and sees that she too is shaking. Her eyes are wide and darting about. Her face is white, the roses in her cheeks nipped away, and seeing Jessie clearly frightened does something to Sam, something unexpected. Her fear just snaps away out of her as the very last echoes of the train die away. Sam is still stunned, but also indignant. You'd never heard that train before, had you? You didn't even believe the story was true. You were just trying to scare me. Jessie nods her head, still unable to speak. Sam sighs, blows out her cheeks, her mind racing with how they can make sense of this, maybe even get evidence of it, to analyse it, to study it. We need to come back here tomorrow at the same time with your tape recorder, Sam announces, whilst Jessie looks at her cousin in total disbelief. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today we're going to be exploring more abandoned places in Bedfordshire and Buckinghamshire. This time, though, we're going to be focusing on more recently abandoned farms, houses, and railway lines. We're also going to take a detour into a piece of tragic family history from Biggleswade, which is linked to a now abandoned building. More of that later, though. In exploring abandoned places, I yet again found more to cover than I originally planned. So although I promised you abandoned hospitals in this episode, that's going to come out in the next one. And you've guessed it, that means some of the episodes I talked about back in July, say around Elizabethan Biggleswade and the Victorian murder case in Bedford, have had to take a back seat until the autumn. I will, however, be finishing this chunk of Weird in the Wade episodes with the Aviation Mysteries episode, covering Glenn Miller, the Flying Duchess, and Amelia Earhart. That episode will be released on Monday the 14th of September, and after that, Weird in the Wade will go on a very short break until it returns in October in time for Halloween. So far in this collection of episodes on abandoned places, we've looked at historical buildings that were abandoned 200 or more years ago. In the last episode, we focused on the Black Death and how in 1340s England, many settlements became untenable when the population was scythed away by disease. But it's surprising how many modern buildings become abandoned. Maybe not whole settlements, but every town or city seems to have its share of disused and neglected properties, from office blocks to shops to houses, which gather urban legends and ghost stories around them, like they gather ivy and brambles. In the countryside, on the edges of our towns and villages, more abandoned places crouch, from cottages to disused farm buildings, to traces of old roads and railway lines that were, until half a dozen decades ago, in use. There's something more visceral about these more recent abandonments, whether it's a Victorian-built rail tunnel or ramshackle farmhouse and barns. Recent abandonment sparks questions in our mind. Who once lived there? Who used these places? Why does no one use them anymore? I will return to the abandoned rail tunnel story that I opened the show with later, but for now, I want to focus on abandoned farm buildings, as well as places decidedly less rural. Devil's Den Farm. I decided to speak with Steph Lay, who you have heard before on Weird in the Wade. She's part of the Scooby Gang who investigated the Golden Pheasant, and she was also one of the experts on the Paranormal Women episode. Steph writes about Milton Keynes, a town synonymous in the UK with the urban, modernity, concrete cows and roundabouts. It is not the kind of place where abandoned farm buildings would be expected. Yet that is exactly what I wanted to talk to Steph about, after reading a blog entry she had written about the wonderfully named Devil's Den Farm. Thank you so much, Steph, for joining me today. And I thought, who better to speak to than someone who specialises in one of the UK's most modern cities, Milton Keynes.
Yeah.
But can you just remind the listeners about your project, about City of Secrets and Milton Keynes?
Yeah, happy to. So this is something I've been running for just over a year now, and it is exploring Milton Keynes, which is one of the places that you think of as the least haunted or possibly unhauntable places in the UK, because it is so modern and planned and everything's so organised and neatly laid out. And it's only been here since the 60s. So the idea that it could have dark and spooky corners is sometimes throws people. But what I'm interested in is looking at its darker side. And my project is going around collecting people's true stories of experiences or encounters that they've had across the city. The way that I'm organising it is Milton Keynes is laid out on a grid. If anyone's been here, they'll have seen all of the roundabouts, but that kind of divides the city up into these nice little blocks. And I want to collect a spooky story from every single one. And at last count, there was 114 of them. They keep building more, so the project will keep expanding. And I've now collected stories from a third of that grid in just a year. And I've got a range of different experiences. And I go and take photographs, and then I publish the stories on my blog. So that's how I've been filling my time over the last year. And it's been a fascinating project.
Just fascinating. I love the fact that it's laid out like an American city on a grid.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
because we're British, we have roundabouts.
Yep.
Milton Keynes, as you've said, is viewed as such a modern place. I was quite surprised when I asked you about abandoned places that you said that there are abandoned places. Were you surprised as well?
Yeah, I could come up with a list quite easily of different places that I've encountered, and it was a surprise. And the way that I started finding these, I was just doing a lot of walking, exploring the city. And we've got this wonderful network of things called redways, because we have these roundabouts and this fast moving traffic. But when they planned the city, they didn't want pedestrians or cyclists tangling with the traffic. So they have this whole network of places where you can just walk safely. There's a lot of underpasses. The redways sometimes cross over these fast roads, so you never encounter the traffic. And I was just exploring. I'd go out for the day just walking, and it's strange. You go from these ultra-modern estates, just go down a redway, turn a corner and stumble on something which is completely abandoned and derelict. And it feels like such a contrast to the rest of the city. It really does make you kind of stop and take a step backwards. But yeah, I found a lot of these little pockets of urban decay in the middle of this beautiful, shining, gleaming new city.
So one of them is known as Devil's Den Farm, isn't it?
Great name.
It's
Yes.
such a cool name. Could you tell me a little bit about how you discovered it and why it inspired you? Because I know you wrote a short story about it as well, didn't you?
It was a complete accident. So this was back in March 24, and it was in that phase where I was just walking and exploring a long time before I started collecting people's stories. And I'd looked online, start of a day, thought I want to go out for a day's walk. And I'd found a story about an old spring over in a part of the city that I didn't know well at all called Calverton. And it was supposed to have mystical properties. It's all overgrown and it's quite hard to find. But I'd found a few clues to it, and I thought, right, it's a grotty day, but I'll put on my big coat, I'll go out and I'll find it. And I walked across a lot of fields, through a little woodland, and I was following the route to this spring. I couldn't find it anywhere. I got myself completely turned around and I thought, that's it. I'm going to go home, off the map now. But I saw there was a cracked old pathway leading up back towards the city. So I thought, if I follow that, I'm bound to get back to somewhere I recognise. So I walked along and I found this amazing abandoned farmhouse and crumbling outbuildings. And as I've always been fascinated by urban exploration and these kind of spooky places, it was like Christmas.
Yeah.
I was walking around it going, this is incredible. Took a lot of photographs, walked all the way around the perimeter in the mud, a gloomy old day. But it looked like somewhere that had been totally forgotten, a place completely out of time. But you could see there was the bones of a beautiful farmhouse there. It was all boarded up. Some of the boards had been pried away, so you could see that people had got in there, covered in graffiti. A stunning place to find out of the blue. And I was just captivated. So close to the estates that I'd walked through, in the middle of farmland though, and just forgotten. There were security fences all around it. And I should say, I'm not an urban explorer myself. So although I could see that there were these tantalising gaps in the fence, I could have wiggled my way through. I was very well behaved. I just took photographs from the outside and came home and started researching it. And I found out it was a Grade 2 listed building. The farmhouse had been built over the remains of a cellar that had obviously been there for a significantly long time, and it had been abandoned for over 20 years at that point. The family had moved out in the early 2000s. It had been sold to developers, and just nothing had progressed on it. It was just sitting there to find. There were some urban exploration videos from people who had snuck in, and even somebody who'd carried out a ghost hunt, which really got my imagination. It kind of sat in the back of my head. I wrote it up for the blog with all of those photographs. And I'm closely associated with the Milton Keynes Literature Festival. They do these regular competitions where they give you a prompt and you write a story based on that. And the next one that came up was for Lammas, for harvest time.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't help thinking of that farmhouse and how it had just been left to decay. And that's where my story came up. The idea of harvest as well made me think of corn dolls and the ones that people make. So I kind of put that with the idea of urban exploration and the people who'd been there, and wrote this story about a group of urban explorers who go in on Lammas night and they find a trail of corn dolls to follow into this derelict ruin. And I had so much fun describing how derelict it was. And they eventually find effigies of the original family. And I made up everything about the ritual sacrifice that was kind of keeping the crops going, and the bloodthirsty farmer, and all of those things were just from my imagination. But I loved taking that into a kind of spooky folk horror space in the story. The story's only 500 words. These competitions are very kind of direct and focused. And I was so happy when they selected it. So that was a real privilege. It then got even darker because just after that event, I found out that the farmhouse had burned down. So I'd been documenting what I thought was just like a decaying ruin that would stay like that forever. But no, it was burned down on the 4th of August. And I went out and took photos of that and spoke to the fire crews. It went from abandoned and derelict to completely destroyed while I'd been writing about it, which added a whole extra layer of eeriness to it. So now it's demolished. The outbuildings are still there, but the farmhouse has gone. I also found the original documents from the listing when it had been kind of logged for heritage purposes, and you can see some photographs of the inside. It's all stripped out. You can't actually see what it was like when it was lived in, but you can imagine what a beautiful place it would have been, looking out over the fields and an active farm for such a long time, which really does get your imagination going. My other favourite one was a ruined office building. If your listeners know Milton Keynes, it's on Precedent Drive in Ruxley. And what fascinated me about this one is it's a really large lot where the building had just been left to decay for a really long time, to the point where there were big trees growing up through the inside of it.
Wow.
All of the windows, it was beautiful mirrored glass, but the windows were all shattered. The doors had been busted in. And when I first found it, you could actually walk right up to the front door, and you could have got inside if you wanted to. But the rest of the industrial estate around it is still functioning perfectly normally. Right next door, there are office buildings that are up and running, other industrial units which are completely active, and they're all looking out over this little derelict corner in the middle of the estate. And it became somewhere that I'd just go and sit and think. They had these big concrete blocks outside to stop you from driving onto the property. You could walk around them. I'd just go, if I wanted to write something, I'd take a notebook or work on my phone and just sit there. And the people around must have thought I was really strange, but it became like I wanted to document the decay as it fell more and more into disrepair. And I kind of visited all through last year, right up until the point where it was demolished. It's now been totally knocked down. I picked up a brick to keep as a souvenir of the time that I'd spent there, but it's now going to be turned into, I think that one's going to be storage units. So that one absolutely captivated me. But I also really like the spaces which were never intended to be occupied, but have taken on a new life of their own through the way that people interact with them. And there's a few, we have a lot of big bridges in Milton Keynes that carry the roads across. And there's one underneath the M1 over at Pineham, which has become like an art gallery for the most amazing graffiti. It's all arched down there. The canal runs through it. People have put the most incredible tags on there, including one that I love so much. It's my desktop wallpaper on my phone, which says occult stuff with a picture of a ghost. So he's become my mascot. I love the way that these spaces have been kind of forgotten by the authorities, but totally repurposed for something else. And I just find that kind of extra use fascinating.
I was thinking about why we're so attracted to these abandoned places. Knowing what one of your specialisms is, I wondered if in a way they're a bit like geographical uncanny valley, in that sense that there's something not quite right with them, and that's why we're kind of drawn to them.
Absolutely. And I think you're onto something with the Uncanny Valley reference. That really, really makes me think things that fall into the Uncanny Valley disturb us. It's usually dolls or robots or statues, those things that are nearly human but not quite. And they just unsettle us because they're not quite what we would expect from somebody who would be human. I think there is something similar with abandoned places because it's something familiar that's been made strange by decay. And there's the beauty in that as well, which I think you need a kind of aesthetic sensibility to appreciate. A lot of people would say they're eyesores, they need clearing. We need to get back to the progress that Milton Keynes is known for, so that should be a shiny new development. But I think where you've got something that, I mean, it's recognisably a house or an office building, it's got all of those things that you would associate with it, but where you'd normally have the normal things that you associate with comfort or utility, they're broken or missing or gone, and you have all these little fragments of normality that you see. Like outside Devil's Den, for a long time there were armchairs just sitting in a field, and you can picture people using those, and you can imagine the fact that they've had to be dragged out and put out there and come up with all sorts of eerie stories there. But I think it forces you to picture the spaces that you know yourself and imagine what they would be like just left to ruin and decay, and we put ourselves almost in an imagined future where those things can happen. So I think part of the draw is just the fact that they are so strange and so unsettling. And for those of us who like spooky things, we can imagine things happening there. But I think it's also the fact that you're almost in an imagined future, and it's a safe way to entertain those spooky thoughts. You can walk up to the dereliction and look at it and know that you're going back to your house, which isn't derelict, which is safe and warm and welcoming. So it's a way to have those sort of vicarious safe scares. And there's just some beautiful photographic opportunities I always find with these spaces. I used to read a lot of Urbex's forums where people would photograph kind of like the beauty and decay. So that's definitely part of the appeal as well. Even when people were doing formal garden design, they would put in follies and mock ruins. So I think there's always been an appreciation that adds something to a landscape that we're just kind of now seeing because it's happening naturally.
Yeah, and if you go back really far to sort of Anglo-Saxon times, we know that they found the Roman ruins really kind of creepy and spooky. And there was this kind of, we're not going to live there, but we will say that it's the place of the gods. That's where the gods live. It's as old as I think we've been humans, that we've had this fascination and also this kind of visceral reaction to ruins.
We don't want things to end up like that.
No.
But being able to look at it and then step away, I think is quite compelling.
Well, thank you so much, Steph. That has been fascinating. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me back.
I'm so grateful to Steph for talking with us about Devil's Den Farm and the other neglected and abandoned places of Milton Keynes. And of course, I couldn't resist doing some more digging into this farm and its history. Could I discover if Shenley Den Farm, to give it its official name, had any connections to the weird or otherworldly before its sad demise? Well, the short answer is that actually, yes, the farm did have some interesting history, but I'm not sure how otherworldly it is. My first observation from looking through some records and newspaper articles was just how frequently the farm was up for sale between the mid-19th and 20th centuries. I wondered if this was usual for farms. Maybe in the past farms were up for sale more frequently. So I searched the newspaper archives for other similar farms, and in particular I looked into one in Biggleswade, West Sunderland Farm, and I found that Shenley Den Farm was a bit of an outlier. It seemed that during the 19th and 20th century, farm ownership generally wasn't changing as frequently as it did at Shenley Den Farm. The farm was sold in 1872 after the death of a farmer Harwood. It sold again just 5 years later in 1877 and again in 1885. All of its stock was sold in 1889. And just to say here, obviously there were regular stock sales of surplus stock, but a farm selling all of its stock seemed to be more unusual. Then the farm is up for sale again in 1908, 1919, 1925, 1928, and in 1937 there is a sale again of all livestock, and it says alive or dead, and surplus household furniture at the farm. The frequency of these sales could be for a number of reasons. Maybe many other farms were actually owned by wealthy landowners, and so they leased them out to tenants. And so sales of those farms were going to be less frequent. They were passed down through rich landowning families. maybe the farm, Shenley Den Farm, was difficult to sustain, though it does seem to have been largely a sheep and dairy farm, which is described on numerous occasions as having extremely healthy and sought-after livestock. Or maybe there was something at the farm which just unsettled some of its owners. Yes, I'm taking a leap into the dark there. We have no evidence for this. But the next interesting news story I found was from a little earlier in the 19th century and is quite different in nature. In 1842 and again in 1844, Shenley Den Farm is in the local newspapers. Because of its miracle ewe, she is described as extraordinary for giving birth to 44 lambs over a decade. That's 4 lambs a year on average, though on some years she actually gave birth to 5, and then on other years 3. Sadly, this incredibly fertile sheep died in 1844, possibly of exhaustion, the poor thing. But unfortunately, I found no creepy history associated with the farm, nor a reason for its nickname, Devil Den Farm. Could it be that its abandonment in 2000 led to it being given that creepy name? Or was there a more sinister reason for why Farmer Underwood's ewe was so fertile back in the 1840s? Joking aside, I think it's a great example of how a once thriving farm that hosted Sunday school parties in Victorian times and carried out tractor demonstrations for children in the 1950s became demonised simply because it was left to ruin and rot on the outskirts of a city. We're about to go for a very short ad break, but don't forget, if you want to listen to episodes advert-free, then join Weird in the Wade's Patreon. Have a look at the show description for more details.
The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
Got a Sam's Cafe pizza order up.
You know the best part about this spicy Italian sausage? I voted for this topping. Yeah, just another perk of being a member. Come join us. Sam's Club.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
West Sunderland Farm. Whilst researching Shenley Den Farm, I mentioned that I'd compared the number of tenancies and sales with a local Biggleswade farm. Well, that farm was West Sunderland Farm, itself now standing abandoned, burned and in ruins. Although I didn't discover frequent sales and leases for West Sunderland Farm, I did discover something else, a piece of local history which reads like the plot of an Agatha Christie novel. The farm today is hunched very close to the new housing development of the King's Reach to the east of Biggleswade. The farm's ruins are waiting to be demolished and houses are to be built on the fields which currently surround it. These fields are still worked for agriculture though. At one point, there were even sheep in one of the fields, but the poor creatures kept escaping. The nearest fields to the farm are often full of sweet corn or maize, one of the eeriest crops you can grow, I think, because they're so tall and so bulky. The wind whispers through them, and you can feel quite hidden if you walk alongside such fields. They're also not very traditional in the UK, unlike in the Americas, so I always see fields of maize and think I'm in a US folk horror. The farm buildings were abandoned a decade or so ago, and over the last few years there have been many fires at the farm, destroying barns and the farmhouse itself. This obviously puts the fire brigade at risk, as well as risking wildlife, and possibly in summers like this one we're currently having, there's a huge risk of fire spreading to the surrounding fields. The farm has been fenced and boarded up in the past, but it seems to not dissuade those whose minds are set on destruction, sadly. The area around the farm now has an eerie feel to it, especially as I remember it being a busy home and working farmyard only, say, 15 years ago. It's in the next section of the podcast that I am going to discuss suicide. Now, it is an old case from the Victorian times, and I will discuss it sensitively and also talk about mental health support afterwards. But if you would rather skip forward, then you'd need to do so by 15 minutes, and then you should be fine. The strange deaths of the Condors. The link to the farm is a slight one, but the more I read about this story, the more I had to keep researching. So please do indulge me as I take a short stroll away from abandoned places and dive into a very sad but mysterious piece of family history. The story is of a father and son, whose deaths some 12 years apart were described by the newspapers at the time as mysterious. Both deaths are linked by the railway and poison. In 1895, West Sunderland Farm was owned by Frederick Conder. His main profession was as an auctioneer and estate agent, a job that he had been born into, his father being an auctioneer and estate agent in Biggleswade also. Frederick, however, was branching out, and in the 1891 census, farmer is added to his list of professions, though I am not sure if he ever lived at West Sunderland Farm. It's more likely that a tenant farmer lived there. After Conder's mysterious death, the farm was sold, and that's how I stumbled across this story. On a Saturday afternoon in early October 1895, a man is found dead in a bathroom at the Great Northern Railway Hotel at King's Cross, London. The first newspapers report this as a mysterious death at the railway hotel, the identity of the deceased having not yet been confirmed. The Great Northern Hotel stands to the west of King's Cross train station and is dwarfed somewhat by the grandeur of the St Pancras Hotel next door. The Great Northern is a neat and narrow building which today is once more a hotel, one of those boutique hotels, and I have been lucky enough to stay there after I had eye surgery. I'd certainly say that the hotel has an atmosphere. Back in 1895, the hotel was modern and certainly a respectable one, and the man found dead is Frederick Conder. A chambermaid named Rose had prepared a bath for Frederick at 10:30 a.m. And back then, en-suites were a rarity in hotels, so this bath had been drawn in a separate bathroom. By the afternoon, this bathroom was still locked, and the water must have been freezing. No amount of banging on the door roused Mr. Conder, and so a porter was sent for, who bashed in the door. The tragic and eerie scene they witnessed must have haunted the hotel staff afterwards. Frederick was found not in the bath, but lying on a couch. He was fully dressed. His head was leaning against the wall. On a nearby dressing table, an open blue glass bottle stood. Both the bottle and Frederick's lips smelt strongly of prussic acid or cyanide. Any Agatha Christie readers here will know that cyanide smells of bitter almonds. A search of Frederick's pockets gave up his identity, and it was possibly not a coincidence that it turned out his brother, the managing director of an Indian railway company, was next door at the rather more ornate St Pancras Hotel. Frederick's brother was sent for, and he identified the body. The inquest was held in a court in St Pancras, meaning witnesses from Biggleswade had to travel down to London to give evidence, and a sad picture emerged. Frederick had bought the prussic acid from a Mr. Robinson, a chemist of Biggleswade. Rather shockingly to our modern sensibilities, Frederick told the chemist that the acid was to poison a dog. That form of cyanide he bought was fast-acting, so perhaps he told the chemist he was going to use it on an old and ill dog who he felt needed to be put out of its misery. Other evidence given by business associates and Frederick's brother all pointed to him being in a state of anxiety and low mood on account of money worries. And indeed, he was in some considerable debt, but the debt was met by the sale of some of his properties. It would have changed his life to meet those debts, but he would not have been left penniless nor homeless. The town of Biggleswade was in shock at his death, especially as Frederick had been an active member of the community, involved in the council and on many committees. There are a couple of notable things in the inquest reports. The doctor, who's a witness, makes a point of criticising how easy it is to get hold of poison. Now, if we think back to the pot and poisoner case from 1843, that's some 52 years before this case. Doctors then were criticising the ease in which poisons could be bought, and it seems not much had changed. The other sad but interesting point is that on reading the news article about the inquest in the Luton Times, you'd think Frederick's only family was his brother, the Indian Railway man. But it turns out Frederick had a wife and children at home in Biggleswade who were left without a husband and a father. It's another example of how times have changed. Today, we would want to know more about a person's relationships than just what they did for a living and what they did for the community. Frederick's son, Roberto, was 28 and living in Hastings when his father died. But he comes home to Biggleswade to take over the family business. He too was married with a son. Roberto doesn't inherit West Sunderland Farm, as that is sold to pay off some of the debts. In fact, when Frederick dies, a committee is set up to deal with the money he owed. And he owed money mainly to his family and business associates, who were also his friends. The solicitor, Mr. Chandler, who we've met before in the episode about John Francis Hunt, the medium, well, he's on the committee too. And it's because of this committee that we know that Frederick's debts could have been paid off, and he wouldn't have lost everything. Once back in Biggleswade, Roberto lives in the house attached to his estate agent's business on the market square, Brooke House. It's a fine, sturdy Georgian building which eventually became a supermarket in the 20th century, but now houses Subway and Specsavers. And yes, there's a picture on the show blog of Brooke House. Roberto, like his father, was active in the community, being on the cricket club committee and an active member of the Agricultural Association. His son Reg was often sick, it seems, and spent time recuperating in Hastings with his mother's family. In 1907, 12 years after Roberto's dad's death, Roberto is on his way home from a trip to Hastings to visit his wife Evelyn and their son Reg, who is now 8. Roberto is seen in London before getting on the train and is described as in good health and spirits. But when the train arrives in Biggleswade, Roberto does not disembark. A passenger named Mr. Della, on leaving the train at Biggleswade, looks back at the locomotive as he mounts the stairs. In one of the first-class carriages, he sees a man. He's kneeling on the floor, with his head resting on the cushion of the seat. His head is to one side, facing Mr. Della, who sees that this strangely positioned passenger looks gravely ill, his skin being as pale as bone. He reports to the station master, "There's a first-class passenger. He looks seriously ill or even possibly deceased on that train. I tried to get the guard to hold it, but he could not hear me over the engine as I called to him. So he let the train leave." A telegram is sent to Sandy, which is the next station north and the train's next stop. At Sandy, the train is halted and the carriage inspected. The body of Roberto Conda is discovered. He is still kneeling in that strange position, head resting on his arms, like a primary school child at the end of the day. The station master recognises him immediately. Roberto is deemed to be already beyond help, and he is carried into the station house. The porter and station master search the carriage, but they find nothing amiss. The police are sent for, and the police officer searches the carriage, then locks it, allowing the train to go on its way. At Peterborough, the carriage is uncoupled and put to one side so that further investigations of it can be carried out if needed. An autopsy on Roberto's body takes place that very afternoon by a Sandy doctor and his colleague from Biggleswade. The inquest is held the very next day at the Bell pub. The doctors are baffled. Interestingly, they do report that Roberto has a particularly flabby, and that's their words, heart, a feature also noted in the autopsy of his father, whose heart was also enlarged. However, both doctors are not convinced that this could cause his death. There are no signs of furred-up arteries, for example. The witnesses called, Roberto's business associates, friends and staff, all say how Roberto was in unusually good spirits in recent days and weeks. The inquest jury cannot come to a decision about the cause of his death, but the doctors did take a sample of his stomach contents. Now, his stomach was largely empty, save for a red liquid, which they thought was port. The doctors are instructed to test this, and the inquest is to reconvene a week later. Roberto Conda's death, kneeling in a train carriage, is written up as another strange mystery. The neighbourhood is described as being under a cloud of gloom on account of his death and its strange circumstances. The difference a week can make, though, when it comes to gathering more information and not just from the medical tests. In the 7 days after the initial inquest was adjourned, a number of pieces of evidence come to light. Mr. Turner, chemist of Biggleswade, comes forward to say that Roberto Conda bought a vermin killer from him. In an echo of Frederick's case, his son Roberto tells the chemist that he's buying the poison to kill his clerk's cat. His clerk, Mr. Wilcox, is flummoxed by this. His boss had never once complained about the cat. His cat did not bother Roberto, and the cat has definitely not been poisoned. Roberto's business associate and solicitor, Mr. Fletcher, who just a week before testified that his friend was in good spirits and whose business interests were doing well, now says that he was misinformed. On sorting through his friend's business papers and correspondence, he paints a very different picture, and an upsetting one. Fletcher says Roberto was being pressed rather severely by some of his creditors. And by this, I assume he means debts were being called in, and in a rather forceful and ungentlemanly manner, because Mr. Fletcher says if Roberto had only confided in his friends and sought advice, this situation could have been remedied. A sadly familiar picture is painted of a man facing some financial and business worries that he passed off to his friends and colleagues as small and uncomplicated, which they actually likely were, but privately, Roberto was ruminating anxiously on them, letting his problems loom, grow and tower over him until they overwhelmed him. You can hear the regret in the simple evidence given by his friend when he laments, "If he had consulted me a few weeks ago, I could have put these things right for him." But the evidence from the doctors held the final answer. The red liquid in Roberto's stomach contained strychnine, the very poison sold to him by Turner, the chemist. What was originally written up as a mystery, an intriguing but tragic railway death, turned out to be something more everyday, but just as, if not more, heartbreaking. A son had followed in his father's footsteps to take his own life when his business affairs became overwhelming and unmanageable for him. The lies to the chemist are so similar, the link to the railway eerie, and the lesson which the newspapers in 1907 only hint at is a lesson we are still grappling with today, which is, if only the Condas, both father and son, had shared their troubles with someone else, if only they'd sought help and spoken about what they were dealing with, maybe working together with their friends, solutions could have been found and payments of the debts met. It's ironic in a way that these inquest reports focus on both men's achievements in business and as upstanding pillars of society. They don't focus on their personal relationships nor their roles as fathers in the same way. Roberto's friends lament that he didn't seek help and advice, but if his worth was measured by how capable and successful he was, it's easy to see why he may have felt too proud to ask for that support or guidance. Obviously, the mental health of this father and son is far more complex than can be summed up in a podcast over 100 years later. But it's worth considering that Edwardian society really pushed the narrative that men had to be capable providers and keep a stiff upper lip. It's a narrative that we're still unpicking today, sadly. Now, I decided to keep this section in the podcast about this family tragedy because my family has experienced suicide. I know the complex grief it causes. I've also experienced depression and suicidal thoughts myself in the past. The stigma that surrounds suicide is a terrible thing, which makes it harder for families and friends affected to cope. It also makes it harder for those who feel suicidal to seek help and support. I really believe strongly that we need to do more to reduce that stigma around depression and suicide. And if talking about it in a podcast can help with that, then I'll keep talking about it when it is relevant. So many of the ghost stories I have uncovered when making this show have had a suicide at their heart. It's a legacy of the shame the church instilled on its parishioners in the past, the history of burying those who took their own lives in unconsecrated ground was a form of punishment and a statement of deterrent, but it never worked. Maybe the ghost stories which grew up around many of these deaths stuck because people in the past weren't encouraged or helped to examine their feelings or fears around suicide or mental illness. Those ghost stories are the fears of our ancestors. They're unspoken and unanswered questions. And the reason they persist is because our societies still attach stigma and shame when it comes to mental health. I'll post on the show blog organisations which can provide support in the UK and in other countries when it comes to mental health and suicide. Disused railway lines, the Old Warden Tunnel. Now, you've waited patiently for an explanation about that opening story that I promised I'd come back to. Just outside of Biggleswade, to the west, is Old Warden, a delightful village of cute cottages with diamond latticed windows, thatched roofs and rose-filled gardens. The kind of village you find on jigsaw puzzles and biscuit tins. Old Warden is surrounded by land once owned and managed by Warden Abbey. And we've come across Warden Abbey before in the episode about Bedfordshire's witches. Before the Reformation, Alice Smallwood of South Hill was sent from Warden Abbey to the ecclesiastical court after she was accused of witchcraft. Now, much of the land around Old Warden is owned by the Whitbread family and managed by tenant farmers. Just outside Old Warden, surrounded by agricultural fields, there is a nature reserve. It's an unusual nature reserve. If viewed from above on Google Earth, for example, it appears as a long, thin strip of lush, unregimented vegetation amongst the neatly ploughed fields. What you are seeing from above is the top of a railway tunnel. It's about a mile long. The railway line the tunnel served was the Leicester to Hitchin line, which when it was built in the 1850s was an important piece of track, linking the Midland line from Bedford to London King's Cross. But shortly after the line was installed, St Pancras train station was built, and the line going directly from Bedford to St Pancras was completed by the Midland Railway. The Hitchin to Bedford branch of the line became just that, a local branch line. The tunnel was needed to cut through the Green Sand Ridge, that piece of elevated land which forms a swathe through Bedfordshire, and in the east of the county is the only high ground really to speak of. The branch line was nearly closed on a couple of occasions in the 20th century because of lack of use, but both world wars saved it from closure. But this short piece of useful railway for those of us who don't drive did not survive the beaching cuts, and the line was abandoned in 1969. By the 1970s, the area around the tunnel had been acquired as a nature reserve, and the tunnel, it was hoped, would attract roosting bats and become a bat haven. Back in the 1970s, guided walks through the tunnel sometimes happened. But I believe by the 1980s, the tunnel was somewhat boarded up. The local rumours about the tunnel's past and its haunted history are centred around a tragic Victorian event. It is said that many navvies or navigators who built the tunnel in the 1850s died whilst working there. The sandy soil was said to have collapsed on them, suffocating the poor workmen. It is those poor navvies' haunting cries that some claim to have heard emanating from the tunnel at night. It's a claim repeated on several YouTube videos about the tunnel because even though the tunnel is now boarded up for bat conservation, this does not dissuade urban explorers from squeezing themselves through a hole in the boards. And it's not just urbexers who have strayed into the dark depths of that tunnel. Some, intent on more destructive activities, have sprayed the walls in graffiti. I've even seen reports of raves being held in there in the past. Speakers being transported into the tunnel because the acoustics in there are so unusual. I'm really not sure what the bats would make of the partying. I can't imagine it's good for them. Of course, the bat guano is certainly not good for humans. Photographs taken by urbexers over the last decade show a tunnel still blackened by the old soot of the steam trains. Graffiti scars the walls, and now bat guano like candle wax seems to drip down the rounded tunnel in streaks. Deeper into the tunnel, small arched doorways and alcoves can be spied. I can certainly see the appeal of sneaking into the tunnel for a glimpse of our past, but there are considerable health risks in doing so today. It's clear from photos that the bricks are unstable and slipping from the walls to pile in places. The bat guano is another health issue. And of course, the tunnel is closed to the public. Sneaking in there is trespassing unless you have permission. In the next episode, I will be chatting with an urban explorer about the risks and rewards of UrbX. But what of this tale of dying navvies in the tunnel? Is it true? Now, I've heard some stories claim that 50 men died inside the tunnel as it was being constructed. There certainly were many deaths on Britain's railway network as it was being built in the 19th century. It's hard to find records of deaths related to construction only. But in 1900, it was estimated that 16,000 railway workers were injured or lost their lives at work. In 1913, this almost doubled to 30,000, according to the National Railway Museum research. I had to double check that, and this number is correct. It's so horrific. But yes, in 1913, 30,000 workers were injured or killed on our railways. Health and safety gets a bad name nowadays, but back in the 19th and early 20th century, safety was considered the responsibility of the employee, not the employer. If someone was seriously injured at work, it was often seen as their fault. There was no sick pay, no benefits, no guarantee that their job would be open for them on return. If someone was to die at work, it was rare for families to get any kind of lasting support from the employer. The middle classes did have the option of life insurance, but they seldom worked in the most risky manual jobs, where it was probably most needed. And again, life insurance policies were the responsibility of the individual. It took pressure from the unions to bring in legislation to improve safety on the railways and to shift that responsibility for maintaining a safe work environment from the employee to the employer. Back in 1854, in late August, construction of the Old Warden Tunnel was underway. The Bedford Times and Independent reported that John Ashby had met with a fatal accident where a bank of oath fell on him. He broke his leg and had other injuries, which contributed to his death in hospital a week later. Yes, a broken leg could often be fatal back then. There was no antibiotics if injury became infected. The inquest passed a verdict of accidental death. Corporate manslaughter was not a concept at the time. The language in the newspapers that he met with an accident is very telling. It's as if the accident crept up on him or bumped into him on the street, something almost natural and everyday. Now, I know it's a common if old-fashioned turn of phrase, but it does seem rather detached. John's burial record simply says that he was killed on the rail. He was 33 years old, and no doubt he had a family, though I have not found a record of them, as he wasn't a native to Bedfordshire, so it's really hard to pin him down. Just 6 weeks later, the Bedford Times and Independent reports that another tragic and almost identical accident has occurred to a tunnel worker at Old Warden. A bank of earth has fallen on Jonathan Lyons. What the newspaper fails to mention is that Jonathan is just 13 years old. The article does explain that his spine was broken near to his neck and that he died in hospital 2 days after the accident. Again, young Jonathan's death is described in the burial records at St Leonard's Church, Old Warden, as killed on the rail. To us, it is horrific that a 13-year-old boy could be working and in such a demanding physical job, let alone being killed at work. Neither article mentions the workers' families or personal circumstances. Young Jonathan also does not appear to have been born in Bedfordshire, which does make sense, as these gangs of navvies were hired in larger towns and set to work on building the railway far from home, just as they had built the canals before that. Many were Irish, though I have found no evidence that John Ashby and Jonathan Lyons were from Ireland. Now, Ashby is a very English surname, but Lyons is a common name in Ireland as well as elsewhere. These 2 deaths are the only ones that I've found connected with the construction of Old Warden Tunnel, but I'm pretty certain that there will have been more deaths associated with the building and the running of that Leicester to Hitchin railway line. I can well understand how the death of this young man, John Ashby, and especially the death of the teenager Jonathan Lyons, could have inspired ghost stories which took on a life of their own. How 2 tragic deaths became dozens. How 2 similar accidents became a much bigger accident. It's another example of how tragic and untimely deaths linger in the landscape of our local imagination. As the 20th century wore on and our response to child labour and workplace accidents shifted, the ghost story became exaggerated, a lesson to remember the mistakes of our past. The next time I hear someone moaning about health and safety having gone too far, I'll remember young Jonathan Lyons, who might have been saved from death if safety had been more of a collective consideration in his lifetime. But what of the ghost train? Well, my first confession is that the story that I wrote is completely fictional, based on the rumours that have spread about the tunnel. So the 2 young girls going to visit, I made up. But it is true that the army did use the nature reserve and the tunnel for a military exercise in 1988. And the stories that swirl around the tunnel are quite vague, which gave me that option to write a fictional story. There are reports of voices being heard crying out from the tunnel, as I explained earlier. And those that have visited to explore the tunnel have said that they've heard other strange sounds whilst inside. And some of these sounds could be interpreted as a train approaching. But there's other reports too, of music being heard or a radio being played in there when there is no one else on the site or in the tunnel. Abandoned railway routes crisscross our towns and countryside like an invisible web. Some have been converted into pleasant walking and cycling routes, like the one between Sandy and Bedford. In other parts of the country, railway tracks were dug up and roads or housing estates have been built on them. In other places, the old railway arches and signal boxes have been overgrown by nature and left as strange relics. But many of these sites do attract ghost stories about phantom trains being heard or ghostly passengers seen waiting at long abandoned stations. One county which seems to have a disproportionate number of phantom locomotives is Lincolnshire. I came across a ghost story from outside Boston a few years ago, which I've since not been able to track down again, so if anybody has heard this too and can point me in the right direction, please let me know. It told of numerous witnesses, whilst driving, seeing a shining train belching out steam and trundling along a wide A road. It turned out that there had been a railway line beneath where that road now stands. The Paranormal Database, and I'll link to that on the show blog, weirdinthewade.blog, has the following stories from Lincolnshire. During foggy weather in Elsham, Lincolnshire, at Anchholme Bridge, an eerily glowing steam train is said to appear on the anniversary of a centuries-old accident which killed 4 people. Meanwhile, over at Grimaldby, a witness reported the following to the database, and I quote, "Walking back to the nearby RAF base after visiting the chip shop, this witness watched a steam engine pulling a coal wagon and 3 coaches pass by a level crossing. The train was silent and in total darkness, moving at speed, with the only light being a dim glow from the fire on the footplate. When the witness mentioned the train back at the base, they were told they must have been dreaming, as the track had been pulled up. When the witness visited the site the following morning, they realised that the track was indeed gone." Meanwhile, at Hallington in Lincolnshire, the Louth to Bardney line was closed in 1956 and its track was dismantled. Yet for years after the railway line's demise, local residents swore that they could hear trains passing by in the night. It's understandable why places which have been recently, or at least in living memory, abandoned and neglected, strike such an uncanny chord for us. Built and lived in or used for decades and then suddenly empty, they appear like a warning or a foreshadowing of maybe our own demise. Nothing is permanent. These neglected places whisper to us, you too are fragile, transient, a mere firefly's flash in the universe. Sites like the disused railway lines remind us of times gone by and how what was once the height of technology became obsolete and unwanted. The age of steam is romanticised as a simpler, more glamorous age, yet our railways were built on the backs of 13-year-old boys, some of whom did not survive the building of them. Is it any wonder that these sites still haunt us? In the next episode of Weird in the Wade, I'm going to explore one very particular type of abandoned building: abandoned or former hospitals. There's at least one ghost story associated with an abandoned wing of Bedford Hospital, and another fascinating piece of history linked to another derelict part of the North Wing of Bedford Hospital. The hospital I was born in was left abandoned for years, and one of the listeners to Weird in the Wade got a chance to look around it in derelict state. That hospital also has ghost stories swirling through its corridors and wards, though sadly the hospital is no longer there. I'll be joined by a very special guest to talk about haunted hospitals in more detail, and I'm sure it's a subject I'll come back to again in the future. Thank you to Steph Lay from City of Secrets Project for sharing the wonderful stories of Devil's Den Farm and Milton Keynes derelict places with us. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Additional editing in this episode was by Tess Savagir, and Tess also wrote the theme music.
Hey, I'm running out to drop off a stack of letters and packages. Need anything shipped while I'm gone?
Save the gas. Stamps.com lets you print postage and schedule pickups right from your desk. Sync your contacts into the address book, get detailed accounting insights, and get notified the moment your certified mail is delivered.
All from my desk?
All from your desk.
Join the 4 million businesses using Stamps.com right now with code PODCAST and get your free welcome gift. Stamps.com, code PODCAST. Taxes and fees apply.
Your team just added its 67th AI tool and also your 67th security blind spot. The good news? The Vanta agent works like a GRC engineer in the background, finding every app your team uses, scoring the risk, and drafting fixes for you. Vanta is the platform used by over 16,000 fast-moving companies like Ramp, Cursor, and Harvey, who are shaping the future with AI and staying ahead of AI risk. Get started at Vanta.com.